Hello and welcome. My name is Mike Sokolow, and I'm the director of the McGillicuddy Humanities Center at the University of Maine. I'm very pleased to welcome you to tonight's event, our undergraduate fellow showcase. The whole showcase is titled The Stories We Tell, and the first showcase last night went wonderfully well, and we're very excited for tonight's showcase. We're so proud of our program and our undergraduate fellows. Before we get started with tonight's official introductions, I'd like to do a few things. First, I need to make everybody aware that this event is being recorded and it will be uploaded to the center's YouTube page. So if you haven't yet, please make sure to mute your microphones through the presentation. And the second thing I'd like to do is to read the University of Maine's official acknowledgement of the land. The University of Maine recognizes that it is located on Marsh Island in the homeland of the Penobscot Nation, where issues of water and territorial rights and encroachment upon sacred sites are ongoing. Penobscot homeland is connected to other Wabanaki tribal nations, the Passamaquoddy, Maliseet, and Micmac, through kinship, alliances, and diplomacy. The university also recognizes that the Penobscot Nation and the other Wabanaki tribal nations are distinct, sovereign, legal, and political entities with their own powers of self-governance and self-determination. Okay, now to introduce you to the McGillicuddy Humanities Center Humanities Specialist, Karen Sieber. It was Karen Sieber who assembled tonight's program, and she'll be introducing our fellows tonight. Karen Sieber helps oversee the day-to-day operations of the center, including the planning and implementing of events, working with faculty and student scholars, and providing outreach and support to humanities institutions and educators statewide. She's focused on promoting the continued relevance of the humanities, and supporting, relevance to humanities and supporting interdisciplinary research and programming that engages diverse audiences. All right, Karen, welcome, and thank you for producing tonight's program, and I turn it over to you.
Thanks, Mike. Thank you all for joining us tonight. This is the second night in a two-night series, a showcase of our 4 graduating fellows. So we have 8 undergraduate McGillicuddy fellows right now that are come in on a rotating basis that represent disciplines across the arts and humanities. The fellows are awarded $4,000 a semester for a 2-semester fellowship, and they're able to work on the research or creative projects of their own devising. So they put together proposals for funding just as a faculty member would. So each of their research is very particular to their subfields. But this year we saw a lot of alignment in that all of the fellows were, in a way, looking at the stories that we tell each other from generation to generation and how powerful that can be, but also how problematic that can be, especially when those that are not in positions of power, when their stories are affected by this. And so I think even though it seems that someone studying Wabanaki diplomacy and education might not have a whole lot of alignment with someone studying the Holocaust in Lithuania, I think you'll see time and time again tonight that there is quite a lot of alignment between these 2 stories and ideas of memory and what gets remembered, what gets passed down, what knowledge is valued. So each fellow will speak tonight for about 30 minutes. Give or take, and we will have roughly a 30-minute Q&A at the end. So we do ask that as you have questions that come to mind, put them into the chat directed to me. You can make them invisible directly to me or available to everyone. We might not have a chance to get to all of the questions depending on time, so I might have to pick and choose or combine a few questions. But we definitely want your input at the end, and I think there'll be some really good conversation starters. So with that, this is a remarkable fellowship cohort. They started during the pandemic. All of them had something that changed about their research. Maybe they intended to do research at a particular archives. Nolan, who would have been doing work within K-12 classrooms, it has now moved to virtual work with students. His work for community workshops has been altered. We have other fellows who presented last night who were unable to do travel related to their research. So these students were able to just pick up and pivot like it was nothing. And I don't think that any of their research has been hindered as much as we were worried it would be. These are some remarkable students with just wonderful futures, which I think will quickly become evident. So first up tonight is Hailey Cedor. She will be speaking on local involvement, memory, and denial, the complexities of the Holocaust in Lithuania. Hailey's a senior English major. She's in our 4+1 program in history, so we'll be continuing on to finish her master's. This is part of her honors research. She started her interest in the Holocaust was with Dr. Knowles, who is here, on Dr. Knowles' Holocaust Ghettos project, but it's turned into this great independent research that Hailey's been working on, examining the complex relationship of current Lithuanians with these past atrocities, and just the difficulties in acknowledging and reconciling the difficult history there, and the dangers of the ignorance that has resulted from it. So in Lithuania, the country's complicated past has left ample room for self-victimization and denial that favors public memory of non-Jewish Lithuanians, leaving the small Jewish community that exists to kind of be forgotten and marginalize their stories. So after Hailey finishes, we will pass the torch to Nolan Altvater. And Nolan is also a senior graduating. He is a future tribal educator, and so he will be speaking on Wabanaki tools of diplomacy, storing protocols as political will, using Indigenous research methodologies. His project aims to center the needs and voices of Wabanaki communities to inform education policy in the state of Maine. For those that are unfamiliar, the state of Maine has a requirement called LD 291, which is the Wabanaki Studies Law. So technically, educators across the state are supposed to be teaching about Wabanaki history and culture, but they're often left without the resources to actually do that, without the financial resources, without the educational resources. And oftentimes, educators are left piecing together the stories, and it's often not inclusive of the Native American community itself and their knowledge systems. And so Altvater is a member of the Passamaquoddy. He's a Passamaquoddy citizen. And so he's looking at kind of the barriers of implementation of this law, and particularly how Wabanaki diplomacy can lead the way to address these issues. And so using these values and knowledge systems as a way, as like a decolonial and kind of anti-racist movement within Maine education. So he will explore the concepts and protocols of wampum and its later form of Indigenous writing, and look at how Wabanaki people have used these tools and their own knowledge systems for empowerment and to resist colonialism. So with that, Hailey is going to start us off.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for coming to listen to our presentations today. As Karen said, the title of my thesis is Local Involvement, Memory and Denial, the Complexities of the Holocaust in Lithuania. I would like to start this with a short warning that this presentation will involve some discussion of violence, murder, rape, and other sensitive subjects. There will not be any visual representations, but if anyone is particularly sensitive to them, please be advised that they will be mentioned and discussed briefly. Due to the gravity of many of these subjects, I will also be presenting more briefly on actual events of the Holocaust in order to make this presentation as accessible as possible. I first became interested in studying Lithuania in relation to the Holocaust through my work as a research assistant for the Holocaust Ghettos project, directed by Dr. Knowles. I was assigned data entry for the Lithuania region, and as soon as I started reading the entries within the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum's Encyclopedia of Camps and Ghettos, I knew there was something unique about this country's relationship with the Holocaust. There were many things that I noticed within these entries, such as immense speed of ghettoization and murder of the Jewish population, the types of forced labor projects that Jews were made to perform, and the temporariness of ghetto holding places. All of these factors will be discussed later, but what struck me most was how these circumstances seem to be dependent on, in many places, an enthusiastic or at least willing collaboration of local non-Jewish Lithuanians in the persecution, ghettoization, and murder of Lithuania's Jewish population. From this experience, I knew I wanted to dig into the subject more and explore not only what local involvement looked like, but why it formed the way it did and how the country currently deals with this history of collaboration and the Holocaust generally in post-Soviet occupation. I've broken my research into 3 general pieces. The first focuses on specific preconditions within Lithuania that provided the dry timber, to use a phrase from Doris Bergen's War and Genocide, for this mass collaboration of local Lithuanians with Nazi officials. The second focuses on capturing what this involvement looked like and trying to measure how much collaboration was present in comparison to how much aid was given to Jewish Lithuanians by non-Jewish Lithuanians. It also seeks to show caveats to negative and positive involvement, giving dimension to those perceived as perpetrators and heroes. The third and final part of my research focuses on how Lithuanians have confronted or ignored this section of their country's history. Within the entirety of my thesis, I explore this with relation to education, legislation, film, memorials and museums, the surviving Jewish community, and in comparison to Poland, which has had its own difficulties reconciling with its past. While we will not have time to deeply discuss all of these elements today, I will be aiming to discuss a few examples from a couple of these areas. There are many unique preconditions within Lithuania prior to the outbreak of World War II that do not by any means justify, but do provide an explanation as to how a political and social vacuum opened, and how that vacuum was filled by anti-Semitic nationalists that partnered with German authorities in order to cause almost complete destruction of the Jewish community in Lithuania. Anti-Semitism in Lithuania and the rest of Europe dates back much farther than the rise of Hitler in the 1930s. A long history of occupation and oppression of Lithuanians, both Jews and non-Jews, cultivated anti-Semitism and a complicated hatred within the country. Between 1939 and 1941, Lithuania was invaded twice, first by the Soviet Union in 1939, and then 2 years later by Nazi Germany. However, Lithuania's struggle against invasion did not begin in 1939. Instead, the country has had a long history of invasion, which has resulted in a destruction of national identity. After centuries of invasion and turmoil, a new resurrectionist movement formed in the 19th century, which was led by the Lithuanian intelligentsia that consisted of the Roman Catholic priesthood. This movement intended to create a national identity based on language. Eventually, this turned into the Lithuanian state that was formed in 1918. Both of these factors, language and land, created ideological divisions between Jewish Lithuanians and non-Jewish Lithuanians. Many Jews within the boundaries of the Lithuanian state that was created in 1918 did not speak Lithuanian, which was what the resurrectionist movement was based on, and often spoke Yiddish primarily with secondary languages of Polish or Russian. Additionally, the 1918 boundaries did not align with what Jews historically conceptualized as Lita, which contained parts of surrounding countries such as Latvia, Poland, and Belarusia. These intended unifying factors of language and country boundaries left out Jewish people from the beginning of the resurrectionist movement. These foundational differences were then sparked by the governmental transitions that took place within Lithuania between 1939 and 1941. In 1939, as a result of the agreement between the Soviet Union and Germany to divide Eastern Europe between themselves, Lithuania was invaded and occupied by the Soviet Union in 1939. This caused a complete overhaul of Lithuania's government and the reopening of old wounds. Lithuania was again occupied and stripped of the national identity that it had finally forged over the recent decades, even though that identity was exclusionary of a large minority within the country. While both Jewish and non-Jewish Lithuanians were affected by Soviet occupation, Jewish people were disproportionately characterized as supporters or sympathizers of the Soviet Union. When Soviet occupation began, 2 opposing factions broke out within Lithuania. One that formed a resistance movement that favored eventual German victory, and another that perceived Soviet occupation to be the new normal. To quote Michael McQueen, while both movements attracted substantial shares of the population, Sovietization in practice brought the displacement, destruction, replacement, or recasting of virtually every social, educational, political, state, and religious organization in Lithuania. In a country in which autonomy was long sought after and briefly achieved, complete restructuring under the Soviet regime caused tension and underground resistance to form. This resistance took form as the Lithuanian Activist Front, or LAF. This underground organization existed within Lithuania with an additional base in Berlin. This group expressed extreme anti-communist and anti-Semitic rhetoric and goals. The creation of this activist group directly affected the mass response of Lithuanians to German invasion in the summer of 1941. Many of these activists stepped into local leadership roles and formed partisan squads that collaborated or initiated acts of robbery, violence, rape, murder, and other forms of persecution of Jewish Lithuanians prior to or as German forces invaded Lithuania. All of these factors are important to understanding not only the response of Lithuanians during the arrival and occupation of German forces starting in 1941, but also how the country currently deals with its memory of Soviet occupation, which returned after the end of World War II. During this next section of my presentation, I will be presenting some of the maps that have been made by Knowles from some of the data I collected from the US HMM encyclopedia that I mentioned earlier. The data I collected came from the approximately 115 ghettos noted within the encyclopedia. I would also like to mention some population numbers to give a sense of the destruction caused during the Holocaust. Prior to World War II, the Jewish population was about 200,000 people. With the addition of refugees prior to June 1941, that number grew to about 210 to 220,000 people. By the end of the war, more than 200,000 Jewish people were killed in Lithuania, and many of them were killed before January 1st, 1942. For context, this means that most of the Jewish population in Lithuania was dead before the United States even entered the Second World War. In some places, the Jewish community was completely wiped out, and it has not been able to revive itself in these places today. Before we get into the maps, I just wanted to add one more note that these maps are not quite in their finalized forms, but I wanted to share them because they show local involvement in a clear visual way. I'm just going to share my screen. Can everybody see that? Okay. The first visualization, the first visualization shows places in which local collaboration of Lithuanians with German forces is mentioned. The black dots represent those places in which collaboration took place, and the white dots are places in which local involvement was not mentioned. This does not necessarily mean that local collaboration did not take place, but it also does not mean that it did. It is clear that in the majority of Lithuania, there was at least some collaboration of local Lithuanians with German forces to take action against Jewish people. Examples of this collaboration vary based on place. However, in many places, violence or general persecution at the hand of Lithuanians is often described as brutal. One example of this includes the extreme vulnerability of women due to the types of forced labor and holding places that Jewish people were forced to perform and live in. One popular form of forced labor included renting or loaning of Jewish women to local farmers or homes to perform agricultural or domestic labor. Through readings in the encyclopedia, other secondary literature, and firsthand accounts, it is clear that many of these women were sexually assaulted and or raped by the men that they were loaned to for work. In addition to this, many of the holding places that Jewish people were held in were temporary, meaning that they typically served another purpose other than living, or they were broken down or hastily constructed structures. This included places like barns, stables, and other agricultural buildings, to things like military barracks without a roof, or even in a few cases, just an outdoor camp with some barbed wire surrounding it. These structures allowed for locals, as well as Lithuanian and German officials, to have easy access to women due to the lack of protective housing structures. Jewish men also suffered greatly in Lithuania, but there is slightly less information about them due to the fact that they were often targeted for killing actions before women and children. In places in which men didn't exist long enough to be tortured, they underwent brutal treatment from those guarding them. One example that sticks out in my mind is what has been called the Devil's Dance or the Demon's Dance, that Jewish men from Telgiai were subjected to at the hands of Lithuanian and German officials. There is no way to accurately convey the brutality of this event without explaining what happened, and so I warn you that this section contains some particularly violent description of this event. The description I'm going to read now is from a book of compiled interviews taken just after the end of the war by Leib Konieczowski, a Jewish survivor in Lithuania. Konieczowski collected over 100 interviews throughout the Lithuanian countryside from survivors that had suffered greatly. The description of the Devil's Dance is as follows. The men were placed in a circle. Lithuanians with spiked sticks and whips stood in the middle and forced the Jews to run in a circle. They beat everyone without exception. The Jews had to run in a circle for a few hours, falling whenever one of the Germans whistled. When they got up, they were beaten on the head and sides. Several elderly Jews fell dead during this dance. A number of women and men among the Lithuanian population came from the city to watch the Demon's Dance, as they called it. The Lithuanians from town came running to enjoy themselves and applauded. I would also like to mention that after this, many of the Jewish men involved were driven back into the barn that was their holding place, but 80 young, healthy men were taken to the forest, forced to empty the water out of prepared pits, and were then shot. This is just one example of this suffering. Moving through a couple of the other visualizations briefly, we see next a map showing places in which local Lithuanians profited from the persecution and murder of Jewish people. This includes direct payment of officials for their actions against Jewish people, the taking of property, business, or houses, and those who sold food or other items to starving and suffering Jewish people. The next few visualizations aim to show presence. This first one is a representation of the places in which German forces were present for at least some of the actions taken against Jewish people. While this was the majority of places, these next two visualizations complicate that presence. This first slide showing dominant presence, which was judged by my perception of the encyclopedia entries and based on the dominant presence of who was more frequently performing the actions mentioned. So we see here that dominant presence of Germans is far lower than the dominant presence of Lithuanians, which is also signified by black dots. This next map measures the places in which forced involvement is not mentioned to have taken place. So in this case, the black dots represent places in which forced involvement was not mentioned within the encyclopedia entries, and the white dots represent places in which there was forced involvement or it was unclear. These maps should be taken with a grain of salt, as it is possible in some places that not everything was recorded or that information has been lost due to lack of surviving evidence. However, I believe most of the trends shown in these maps to be true based on information from the rest of my research. Moving on to discuss the presence of help or aid given to Jewish people by non-Jewish Lithuanians, this final map shows the places in which local help was provided, signified again by the black dots. I did not include mentions of people that sold items to Jewish people or those who are noted to have held on to items for their Jewish neighbors when it was explained that those people knew of the death that awaited them. As you can see, mentions of help are far fewer than those of collaboration. There are a few reasons that why this may be the case. The major one is that many people were anti-Semitic and or anti-communist and would not go out of their way to help a Jewish person, especially based on the preconditions discussed earlier about anti-Semitism and hostility towards the communism brought in by the Soviet Union. Another reason could be the fear of death, imprisonment, other punishment, or social, political, and economic outcasting that could be the result if for some reason it was found out that they were helping Jewish people in some capacity. That being said, the places in which local help was recorded was sometimes followed by a note that implies or states that the survival of some Jewish people would not have been possible without the aid of local Lithuanians. I'm going to stop sharing my screen at this time. I will quickly mention now that there are many difficulties in classifying perpetrators or heroes within Holocaust-related research. While some cases are clear, usually in the case of perpetrators, that their actions were based out of their own motivation and misguided hatred, it is important to also recognize the fear that went through all parties involved in the Holocaust. This, of course, does not excuse their actions, but it does add a dimension to what makes a perpetrator. The same is true for classifying helpers or heroes during this time period. While many survivors would not have lived through this event without the assistance of some guards or local inhabitants, their motivations were not always necessarily pure. After World War II, Lithuania became under the control of the Soviet Union. I have not looked much into the commemoration and memory within the country during this time period because so much of the country's operations were under the control of the Soviet regime. In my opinion, this did not represent an accurate history of how Lithuanians would deal with the memory of the Holocaust, because it was more about how the Soviet Union at large dealt with the memory. For this reason, my research takes place in the post-Soviet period from the 1990s through more recent years. For the remainder of my presentation, I will be exploring a few areas of memory that I have researched. There are many forms of memory, which was an issue I had to pick apart for this project. There are endless resources that contribute to public memory. The first area that I really wanted to explore through my thesis was film representations of the Holocaust made in Lithuania. While the film industry is not huge in the country, it has grown in recent years, and I wanted to look at some form of popular culture that would represent how the public interacts with its history. I was only able to find one film that dealt exclusively with the Holocaust. It is called Ghetto, and it was made in the mid-2000s. It is also important to point out that this film was supported by the president of Lithuania at the time, the mayor of Vilnius, as the film is about the Vilnius Ghetto, the Council of Jews in Germany, and the Jewish community in Lithuania, and a myriad of other government bodies and private businesses. Despite these endorsements, the film largely neglects to address the issue of local collaboration of Lithuanians. Non-Jewish Lithuanians are only mentioned twice throughout the entire film, once to say that a local Lithuanian helped a Jewish person that was wounded, and the other instance quickly and vaguely referenced Lithuanians helping with a murder action in another place. The film heavily implies that Germans were the sole perpetrators, and there are multiple examples of violence throughout the film that show this. There are a few scenes in which they show the inner conflict of Jakob Gens, the head of the Jewish police in the Vilnius Ghetto. But aside from this conflict, the film is damaging to overall public memory within Lithuania because it does not force a confrontation and reconciliation with the history of local collaboration with Nazi officials. Related to this topic as well, when I was trying to find more film examples for my research, I came across another type of Lithuanian historical film that dealt with Lithuanian oppression under the Soviet regime. These films, including Forest of the Gods and Utterly Alone, focus on the suffering of Lithuanians at the hands of the Soviet Union. While I did not have time to watch these films, the plot descriptions I found showed a heroization of a Lithuanian activist in the comparison of Lithuanian suffering to Jewish suffering. In the case of Utterly Alone, made in 2004, the film celebrates a Lithuanian partisan, Juozas Juksa, who was a member of the LAF that I discussed earlier in this presentation. Instead of coming to terms with the problems of the LAF and the harmful results of their formation, this film celebrates them as heroic. Furthermore, there has been a recent push within Lithuania to name 2021 the year of Juozas Juksa, despite allegations that Juksa was involved in the murder of Jewish people during German occupation. The Jewish community in Lithuania has voiced concern about this possibility, noting that as Western countries begin to reevaluate their own historical heroes, Lithuania should do the same. This shows the continued relevance of Holocaust memory and the attempted erasure of past wrongs in order to avoid accountability. In addition to this film, the other film that I mentioned, Forest of the Gods from 2005, attempts to equate the experiences of Jewish people under Nazi rule to that of Lithuanians under Soviet rule. It follows the story of a man that escapes a concentration camp, only to be targeted again by Soviet officials after writing a memoir of his life experiences. The description of the film notes that the oppression of Soviet rule is just as oppressive as a German concentration camp. This is obviously not true based upon the evidence I have presented today. However, this equation of suffering has happened frequently in recent Lithuanian history. Not only does this practice attempt to excuse and erase the role of Lithuanian perpetrators during the Holocaust, but it also minimized the near destruction of the Jewish community in Lithuania. Another area in which this is reflected is the passage of laws that outlawed the use of Nazi and Soviet symbols. This did not take place until 2008, and these symbols were banned at the same time. An article from the BBC at the time stated that this seemed to be done in order to infuriate Russian officials and equate the symbols of these regimes. Yet another example of this equation can be found within the Museum of Occupations and Freedom Fights in Vilnius. While this is what it is currently named, as recently as 2018, this museum was called the Museum of Genocide Victims. This received significant backlash that prompted the name change, as the majority of the museum is dedicated to commemorating those who fought against Soviet occupation. There is one small room within the basement of the museum that is dedicated to Jewish victims of the Holocaust, and even in that space, there is a section attributed to Lithuanians that helped Jewish people during that time period. There are many reasons why this type of commemoration was and still is dangerous. The main point that needs to be reconciled within Lithuania first is that what non-Jewish Lithuanians suffered during Soviet occupation was not a genocide, and it was not equal to that suffered by Jewish people at the hands of Germans and their own neighbors. There was not an attempt to wipe out the entire existence of Lithuanians. The second reconciliation that needs to be made is that there were Lithuanian perpetrators during the Holocaust, and there needs to be reparations made in support of the Jewish community. Without proper support for the current Jewish community and a reconciliation with the past, the country will continue to foster anti-Semitic attitudes and hostility towards the Jewish community that is slowly trying to rebuild itself. As a conclusionary statement, I just would like to add that Lithuania is not the only country that needs to take action towards reparations and reconciliation with the past. As we have seen with the United States and numerous other countries, there are systemic problems that will continue to cause injustice until they are rectified. I wanted to add this to make sure it is known that I am not passing judgment on another country's lack of reckoning with the past while not addressing that the same issues exist within the country I live in. Thank you all for listening, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts and questions.
Thank you so much, Hailey. And now to Nolan Altvater, who will be speaking on Wabanaki tools of diplomacy.
Yes, thank you, Hailey. I think the way that you wrap up your presentation really serves as a good transition into mine. So I will begin with sharing my screen as well. I have a PowerPoint for everyone today. All right, thumbs up if you can see my screen. Sounds good. All right, Kwe Sitewen. Hello, everyone. Nadoli was Nolan. My name is Nolan. Nudapek Sabayak, Peskodamakat Manil. I am from Sabayak, and I am Passamaquoddy. And the story I will be sharing with you today revolves around Wabanaki tools of diplomacy and how storying protocols can serve as political will. My two, it's hard to say advisors, sort of my two really sort of parents within this research, Dr. Bridie McGreevy and Dr. Darren Ranko. And I know we started with a land acknowledgement here, but I want to maybe add on to this land acknowledgement, saying, what can we do beyond just acknowledging land? Sort of what action can we take to do more than just an acknowledgement within institutional spaces? And I also want to take some time to say Gichi Wooly1 Sitewen. Thank you everyone listed here. As I mentioned, Darren and Bridie, Jan Paul, Angie Reed, and the Penobscot, the Penobscot River. Jan Paul and Angie Reed are both water scientists over there. Rebecca Sockbeson and Donna Loring for doing the previous work where I found my story with an LD 291. David Francis, Sherry Mitchell, Wayne Newell, and Donald Soktoma, my auntie Carol Dana, Wayne Newell, Newell Louie, and the Wabanaki Youth and Science Program, and of course, the McGillicuddy's Humanities Center. Thank you for everyone in supporting me and finding my story and giving me the energy to share it with you today. And I'd like to begin with the methodologies that I used for this project, which is Indigenous Research Methodologies, or IRM. I'm centering Wabanaki stories and voices as a way of reproducing knowledge and making meaning within a colonial institution. And it is within these stories where I'm also yarning a story of my own, which is exactly what my research tells of. It tells itself through the process and the product of my experiences, of my thinking and my writing. However, in order to do this yarning, I did follow a specific set of principles, which as you can see is listed on the screen here. And these principles really overall create a paradigm shift within the field of research. The field of research and academia dominantly suggests that relationality causes bias. And of course, this sort of disregards that we as humans are truly all interconnected, in which my project sort of will convey that as well. And in regards to Wabanaki knowledge reproduction, Wayne Newell has a quote that I think really encapsulates what I mean by that when he says, well, it's not my knowledge that I have contributed. I like to think of it more like this. The knowledge is the energy created between us when we have these discussions. That is actually Wabanaki knowledge. And I just want to note the perspective on knowledge here. It's something that's active, interactive, revolving around energy that flows through the connection of oral dialogue. So Indigenous research methods sort of allows this type of knowledge to exist in these colonial spaces, and sort of what allowed me to find and develop my story. So I'll begin with briefly going over the Wabanaki Studies Law. It was written by Donna Loring and Donald Soktoma back in 2001, and it requires all Maine public schools to teach Wabanaki curriculum. It went into full effect in 2004 with a state commission in place. However, in 2005, the commission, which is known as the Wabanaki Studies Commission, dissolved due to a lack of funding after submitting a report that analyzed the law and outlined action steps for stakeholders. In response to this lack of implementation, Rebecca Sockbeson, who's a Penobscot scholar and a professor of education policy, published Maine Indigenous Education Left Behind, which she further highlighted sort of the context of the law and provided some more specific steps for the university to take, which she also echoed in her Libra professorship report. Both are available to the public, and I highly recommend reading them for some really strong context within the law, or of the law. And this sort of leads us to where we are today, 20 years later, with none of the recommendations that have been put forth being met, the commission is still non-reinstated, and all of the barriers still in place. And this is a serious issue for tribal nations. We really hoped that LD 291 would contribute to the many efforts of the mobilization and truth, overall confronting our racist experiences here in Maine. And without this mobilization of truth, there is really no true healing for our communities and our relationships with each other. And I want to emphasize the relationship with each other, because that emphasizes sort of the cultural crisis as an ecological crisis, and how supporting Indigenous sovereignty through public education is also supporting ecological sustainability and environmental justice within the state of Maine. And the reason for this is because Indigenous ways of knowing and being are heavily or revolve around intimate and interdependent relationships with the land. We are spiritually based off of our experience directly with the land. shapes the way that we live. Thus, we treat the land as kin and take care of it in a sustainability way. So sort of having Indigenous ways of knowing and being as policy will also help resolve ecological crises here in Maine. And it was also advocated by elders on the Wabanaki Studies Commission when it was in place to teach both the quote, beautiful and ugly knowledge. This was actually argued by non-native Wabanaki Studies Committee members, which is an example of what Tuck and Yang call settlers moved to innocence in their article, Decolonization is not a metaphor, where sort of a conscientization is going on, where people are recognizing something bad happened, but they don't necessarily do anything about it. It sort of stops at the mind. And then there's also asterisk people or at-risk people where we sort of forget the past, we passed a law, the Indian problem is now solved, which sort of also goes back to sort of not actually taking the needed action. And what I mean by difficult or ugly knowledge would be this example of the Phipps Bounty Proclamation of 1755 that awarded pounds or money for the scalp of Penobscot citizens. And it's also worthy to note here that the scalp of a female was actually less than a scalp of a male. So you can also see the interlocking mechanisms of colonization with patriarchy and other social issues as well. And there are numerous barriers to implementation, with the lack of funding and access to content delivery arguably being the biggest. However, I want to echo, clear and tangible action steps have been suggested for the state and its universities to take from both the Wabanaki Studies Committee and Professor Rebecca Sockbeson in both of her LEAP report and article that she published, in which I mentioned previously. And in regards to the recommendations that have been made, these are the ones that were made by the Wabanaki Studies Commission in the report that was published in 2003, which is also available, just a quick Google search with the word PDF after that you can find if you want to read more intensively. Again, none of these have fully been met today, and they were of course followed by Rebecca's recommendations in her article, which were very similar, but she also added some specific steps for the state and the universities. And again, this leads us today where none of these recommendations have been made, which sort of leaves us with this question of how can we follow these recommendations? And what I am suggesting here today, that the tools, the concepts, and the protocols of Wabanaki diplomacy could be of significant help in the implementation of this bill and taking the needed action. In fact, I suggest that these bills being written and supported by Wabanaki people were meant to follow this diplomacy, which is actually arguably the oldest form of social order. And it involved really the uses of wampum and Wikhikon. As an oral culture, we never had a written system that necessarily pertained to an alphabet per se, but we still had our own unique and valuable ways of maintaining social and political institutions. And we really did this through storytelling, or what I call image making, sort of using mnemonic tools that have the power to shape and change the physical universe while bringing communities together in diplomacy. And we'll be exploring the concepts of both of these tools, starting with wampum. And what wampum is, it consists of blue and white beads made from quahog shells that are weaved together in belts in order to mnemonically symbolize speech, or they were the foundation for maintaining our civil and political customs, and they were also symbolic stories of the past. And it's actually worthy to note as well that it's argued that wampum of the Iroquois Confederacy actually influenced the democratic thought that led to the Constitution of the United States, which I think is yet another sort of contribution of Native sort of intellectual thinking that is not taught, as with many other cases as well. And the story of wampum really begins with our creation stories, the stories that define us as people, reflect our values as Wabanaki people and how we understand our place within the world. And I want to emphasize that these stories are a form of resistance. They're a strategy for protecting and preserving identity. Muskogee scholar Craig Womack suggests that politics, land, and story are deeply intertwined entities. Thus, our stories, which is what connects us to the land, are also connected with law. And this is why Native identity is a form of resistance. Furthermore, our stories gift us order and significance and the power to sort of push back against tyrannies by responding with intelligence and invention when we are confronted with situations. And this is where wampum found its place within our stories as a tool to maintain peace and diplomacy in face of the tyrannies that occurred in the spaces we share. It's sort of a story within the stories. And although wampum has been used for diplomatic purposes throughout time by the Wabanaki, today we will be focusing on the protocol and records from its use of the Great Council Fire, which is where the wampum laws originated from. The Passamaquoddy record of this event was actually preserved in wampum belts as well, and kept by our wampum keeper, Sapiel Selmo. However, when he passed away, his knowledge, being the wampum keeper, also passed with him. However, the thing with oral cultures is that the energy within our knowledge systems can live on generation to generation, in which it was recovered and it is now published thanks to the work by Passamaquoddy historian David Francis under the wampum records. And we won't, for the sake of time, I won't go through every single Confederacy belt that we have recovered today. Rather, I'll sort of go over the general insights of them as a whole. And the story of all of the belts really shows us that each of them symbolize a unique agreement made in a council that really has its own specific protocol and ceremony, such as declaring war, declaring peace, or sort of encapsulating why people were gathering in the first place. The strings on the end stood for the dialogue made around that decision, and the strings of the ceremonial belts were actually never tied to symbolize that the decision that the belts told was ongoing, or the dialogue, the story was ongoing around the decisions. Ceremonial wampum was called galusawagan, or speech. And in regard to the colors that were used, the blue and the white, the blue stood for both war and the experiences of genocide, and the white color represents sort of peace in the path of continuing our cultures. And in regard to the protocol that is involved with wampum, they all prioritize gathering and letting everyone have an equal voice in the council and decisions. You know, everyone is the same height within our traditional gathering circles. At the Great Council Fire, matter of fact, leaders actually sat in silence for 7 days and then opened up the wigwam, or the house that they were in, and named it Mazi Dokwen Doli Westu, or Every One of Them Talks. The wampum, which overall stood for their unionship, or the Great Fire that they made, would always be in the center of the leaders who sat around it. So they would symbolically sit around and talk around their reasons why they were gathering together. As I mentioned before, there's also a wampum reader and keeper, who we referred to as the Baduswin. So what do these symbols and protocols of wampum teach us today? The teachings of the use of the color have sort of philosophical, pedagogical, and diplomatic teachings. And in regard to the Wabanaki Studies Law, for an example, the use of both white and purple colors suggests us to teach both the beautiful and difficult knowledge. In other words, if LD 291 was said made in a wampum belt today, it would be made up of both purple and white shells. Thus, we should teach both the difficult knowledge and the beautiful knowledge, since it's made of both colors. Another teaching comes from Mazi Dakwin Toliwestu, or Every One of Them Talks, telling us to gather as equals and give the opportunity for everyone to have a voice in decision-making across communities. We also used wampum not just intertribally, but within decisions made with settlers as well. But as we see, that sort of they mistook that action of giving wampum later on in this presentation. And this sort of decision making also takes time and relationship building, which was seen at the event of the Great Council Fire, when they sat in silence for 7 days before coming together and talk. We also learned from the role of the wampum reader, where that having someone knowledgeable of the past able to have the voice, which directly contrasts to sort of today's political climate here in the state of what is now called Maine, where tribal members who are representatives within the legislature don't have the right to vote or in decision making. Maine is very sort of behind in regards to other states with their relations with Indigenous communities, and it's clearly time to sort of give them that right as well. So to close out the teaching of wampum, concisely put, I'm suggesting here that the Wabanaki's use of wampum, or our traditional ways of governance and diplomacy, can be of significance to informing policy development and implementation, such as the Wabanaki Studies Law, and can thus help our relationships with each other and the places that we share. And it also teaches us we must focus again on both a difficult and beautiful knowledge in order to make full meaning. So what happened to wampum? First bullet of settlers mistaking it. Settlers mistook the act of giving wampum as a symbol of submission and an acceptance of their, quote, protection, and also a pledge to their colonial laws, rather than a bond of alliance among equals. In other words, when obviously not speaking the same language, when we would make first contact with them, we would offer them wampum to signify a relationship where we both have responsibilities of reciprocity, but they mistook it for, here is this form of payment, can you please protect us? We will abide to your laws. And in regards to settlers mistaking wampum for currency, there was actually cases where they would impose mortgages and deeds on Indigenous women and leaders. And it's important to note that our political systems were heavily matriarchal. So obviously when, say, Indigenous woman husband passed on and she owned the land, that didn't really correlate with settler colonialism ways of being or ways of understanding the world. So they would actually impose mortgages on these women in which they would actually demand the payment to be made in wampum. And once a very significant amount of wampum was collected and brought to the settlers, they would actually reject it and then prefer instead to convert the mortgage to an English written deed. And I want to emphasize this refusal of wampum and preferring the written deed because it connects sort of wampum and Wikhikon together, because Wikhikon now translates to anything written, any written document. And it also highlights our assimilation into a system, in this case, a written system that was used against us to appropriate our lands. And therefore, also the first written elements of Native American literature can be really seen as deeds, treaties, and maps. And this was also a time of modernism, you know, the 18th and 19th centuries. Linda Twice Smith suggests that this was a time of when Indigenous forms of knowledge and our technologies, such as wampum and codes of social life, were regarded as new discoveries, quote, new discoveries by Western science, and they were then commodified as property, tucked into the cultural archive body of knowledge of the West, and then reproduced through that system. And it was also an era of collecting by museums for the sake of preservation or rescuing them from decay. Many Indigenous people might call this stealing rather than collecting, as Linda Twice Smith supports. And however, over time, Native leaders and Wabanaki people sort of started to see and progressively grasp the full meaning and potential of a written system, the power of a writing system. And this sort of suggests an epistemological shift or shift in our ways of knowing and being. And I think the quotes here from David Francis really encapsulates that, where he says sort of, we did not need writing before, we had wampum, wampum readers in our stories. Now we don't have any. However, we are trying to keep this knowledge alive with the book, with something written. He's very well known also for his work with the creation of Passamaquoddy Dictionary, which again shows how we've sort of taken writing or a tool of colonization and now use it for our own creative and specific purposes to resist colonization. And again, this sort of suggests an epistemological shift or a shift in our ways of knowing, and sort of the connection between wampum and Wikhikon, or the wampum belts, and the anything written. And it sort of highlights our intellectual tradition of adaptation, or our sort of intellectual sovereignty that we have. And we've sort of always practiced here in what is now called Maine since time immemorial, sort of constantly adapting to the changing environment through creation of new tools. We still hold on to our traditions, but we still change our tools. And I want to note here, sort of emphasizing that just because there's a change within a culture doesn't make it non-traditional per se, especially in regards to Native American cultures, which are dominantly viewed as if change only happened after contact with settlers. Craig Womack also suggests that Indian cultures are the only cultures where it is assumed that if they change, they are no longer a culture. Obviously not true. And this is not the case for Wabanaki cultural, because our energies in regards to our language and ways of being and knowing revolves around constant energy and interaction. And in regards to the Wikhikon, sort of from a linguistic perspective, we can see that it's made of both, it's formed from a verb and is conceived as a product of an action. In other words, an action needs to be put in place in order for it to take meaning. It's made from the inanimate suffix igon, which is used for tools such as ptarmigan or the cutting tool, and thus it can be literally translated to a written tool. The English translation for it is anything written. Before we had a written system, it referred to birch bark carvings and birch bark maps. And I want to emphasize in this analysis, we can sort of see within Wabanaki ways of knowing and being, we don't separate the image from the word, which is the same thing with wampum, where the ceremonial wampum was literally called galusawagan, or speech. So the image is interrelated with words. Thus, the action is interrelated with the product, which is important to keep in mind. Lisa Brooks gives a great definition of Indigenous writing and its process as a tool for image making, for writing, for transmitting an image or idea from one mind to another over waterways over time. And we can sort of start to see a protocol for Indigenous and Wabanaki writing here that involves a process in which, until a specific action that puts the energy into motion is taken, the image or the writing does not take its full potential form or its full power. And with the interconnection again of image, action, word, this not only refers to completing a piece of writing, such as this presentation or LD 291, but taking the action in which the words or the image evokes or call for. And this would be exactly similar to wampum in the protocol and the action of gathering in order to produce full meaning with the wampum belts. And when I say energy here, I suggest viewing it as a force that works towards the future and continued survival of Wabanaki people. And this really shows the power of the Wikhikon, which Indigenous scholars have argued that Indigenous writing has a power to change the physical universe, such as ceremonial chant. And we've actually seen this here at the University of Maine with the recent signage project that Darren's been a part of, that includes Wabanaki place names and signs around campus. and also with the ban of Native American mascots and offensive place names. These written bills or written projects are physically changing the environment that we are in. So now going back to the Wabanaki Studies Law, but from the Wikhikon perspective and its process, we can see that sort of the story of the law exemplifies the concepts, the process, and the power of writing to change the physical universe, and how a specific protocol is needed for it to reach its full meaning and produce the political and practical change that it calls for. The energy put into the bill definitely, as Sockbeson suggests, functions as an educational policy grounded in anti-racism and decolonization, and thus it works towards the future and continued survival of Wabanaki people. And we can also see the need of councils or gatherings, since policy truly is a process in which we are all involved in, which includes the involvement of all stakeholders to come together and engage in dialogue to meet these recommendations. So we can see sort of how the protocol of both Wampum and the Wikhikon gives us a framework that centers Indigenous voices and ways of knowing while working towards Indigenous futurities, which is an effort of decolonization. And we can see that sort of until this protocol is followed and these action steps are taken, the process of writing or the weaving of wampum is ongoing, the Wikhikon or the bill remains incomplete, and the call for anti-racist conviction as political will towards decolonization continues. And the state of Maine is actually in a great position to act, I suggest, with, again, the recent ban on Native mascots and the Wabanaki signage project here at University of Maine, but also the really unique research partnerships and collaborations that are being led by Indigenous communities at the University of Maine. It sort of gives that framework of paradigm shifts within education. So concisely put, I'm calling for stakeholders to engage in Wabanaki diplomacy and supporting sovereignty with tribal communities to meet the tangible recommendations that have been made for them and complete this process of the Wikhikon, or the Wabanaki Studies Law. For my suggestions, which are echoing Rebecca's suggestions, but sort of in order, where we start with reinstating the Wabanaki Studies Commission using state funding and university support, hire Indigenous faculty within the College of Education and Human Development, work with them in both the tribal communities to develop a compulsory course at the 300 level for all practicing educators to take in order to become certified. These teachers need to be certified correctly in order to go out into the field and teach according to the law, which of course takes revising teacher licensure requirements and testing measurements, or the praxis exam. In doing so, I think UMaine will really live up to their slogan that they use of defining tomorrow or changing the physical landscape. And the University of Maine actually has a great model to build off of. In 2012, where Rebecca Sockbeson teaches at the University of Alberta, they set historical precedent by developing really the first course of its kind that was titled Aboriginal Education in the Context for Professional Development, which reached more than 1,000 students per year, where it addresses Indigenous history, contemporary issue, treaty rights, anti-racism, Indigenous knowledge systems. The province also recently legislated a standard for teacher licensure, which I just mentioned, and sort of addresses all these components except for anti-racism. So you may need to, you could even add to that framework. And however, there is current action towards implementation being taken, especially within the Portland Public Schools network, specifically really being led by Fiona Hopper, who actually just had an article published that tells of her experience with working with tribal communities in the Wabanaki Studies Law. I'm currently student teaching at Casco Bay High School under my student mentor, or my mentor teacher, Caroline C.C. Robinson. And we are also working in collaboration with the science teacher, Jackie Cuthbert, We are working in collaboration with Jan and Angie of the Penobscot Nation's Water Quality Team in sort of developing a place-based experience for the students, and sort of developing a RED pedagogy within the Casco Bay High School community. There is a Wabanaki Studies Committee, not a commission. The commission was a federally appointed and tribally appointed commission where tribal nations selected people to be on that commission. And the Wabanaki Studies Commission is sort of really just a group of Portland school teachers as well as tribal citizens working together. There's also something called Moose modules within the Department of Education that's putting together that involves a unit revolving around Wabanaki curriculum. However, I recently did meet with 2 individuals who are working on those modules, and it was concerning for both the way that they were teaching the curriculum, such as like having students write their own oral storytelling, which is sort of a form of playing Indian, but also these modules seemed to have a lot of time put in with them, and tribal nations and citizens are sort of just now hearing about it. So again, it's just being left out of the process of writing or of these creations. In regard to the feedback that I'm getting from students at Casco Bay High School, as a tribal citizen and educator, it's been really overwhelming and powerful to read and feel how they've been interacting with Wabanaki studies. These are just a few glimpses of how they're interacting with it, but really they're echoing I'll read the second half of the longer one, how this knowledge gives students a sense of reality and also brings up a lot of emotion towards the dehumanizing actions seen against Native Americans and can make people understand how terrible it was and how we need to learn more and do more to respect both the history and the present day existence of Native Americans. I was really blown away when I read that. And I truly appreciate my experience of student teaching at Casco Bay. And I'm suggesting to take that similar framework that the Portland Public Schools is taking, where they're working with tribal nations, developing reciprocal and ongoing relationships to address power and justice, sort of not just treating the presence of Native communities as a checklist where you come in, you come out, and the relationship stops there. They're implementing a RED pedagogy, which disrupts the colonial structures of education and the development of a conscious within students that revolves around individualism, while also supporting environmental, land, and social justice. I also suggest developing curriculum, of course, in collaboration with Indigenous nations throughout the whole process, not just like, we made this, can you look at it? Supporting Indigenous sovereignty through public education by sharing with tribal nations and making our ways of knowing and being policy, again, helps in the healing of social relations and ecological crises. In regards to the next steps for this project, I'm going to continue teaching at the Casco Bay High School, further developing a RED pedagogy and a Wabanaki pedagogy. Recent work with actually Karen here, developing a Wabanaki resource portal. She's a great digital humanist work, and I'm really excited for that project as well. After the summer, I will be relocating to the Cambridge area, studying education policy and analysis at Harvard University in their graduate studies. And then also beginning on documenting the Portland Public Schools experience of working with tribal nations and sort of telling the policy story and the stories within that story to provide a framework for other school districts to take. Of course, working towards the recommendations that have been previously made. And what I really want to look forward to is revamping the Wabanaki Writers Project, which would take the form of sort of a writing camp for Native youth to engage with their traditions and Wabanaki writing concepts, but also serve as sort of a professional development and relationship building for non-Native communities as well. And I just want to end here with this quote: the war for Indian children will be won in the classroom, from Wilma Mankiller. And I just want to emphasize here that Indigenous sovereignty is not an end goal within this war. Rather, it's a first step in the process of Indigenous futurities and the healing of the land and all of the relationships within her story. And with that, I just want to say, Tahoe, that is all, and Kachiwali1, thank you very much for listening to me speak, and I look forward to engaging with your dialogue and questions as well.
Well, thank you very much, Nolan. Really just both such great, excellent projects that really have such important, implications for much needed change. So our director, Michael, has sent a question. So he says that both of these projects really call on established power structures to accept their complicity in the genocide or in colonization. What are some communication strategies to bring them to the table, to make for serious change? Not just on paper, not just in name, but impactful change. Is it something that can happen strictly with the government? I mean, there's like in public history, there is this idea of shared authority and like really recognizing the need to, for inclusion of numerous voices, and that often there are these problematic relationships with the government. We've left it up to them to do the right thing. They have failed. How much stock should we be putting in the change coming from the government? How much should, does change need to happen from the community itself to say, you know what, we're done waiting on you. We see a better way. Where do you stand as far as how much of this is going to come from the government, and how can we spark that urgency within them?
I can start. This is actually a question I've been thinking about in one of my classes this semester as well, like the idea of what drives change. Is it people or is it government structures? I am on the side that it is people, because even if you get laws passed, the implementation, I think as we've seen with especially Nolan's presentation, isn't always there. And so I think that first and foremost, accurate education is really important in all levels of schooling. And like with some of my other research with education, I've seen in Polish education systems that they are teaching a curriculum that equalizes Polish and Jewish suffering, similar to what I talked about with Lithuanian Jewish suffering. And so I think that contributes a lot to minimization of the Holocaust and the memory of that event. So I would say education is one of the main things I would push for.
Yeah, I would also echo that answer of sort of education being sort of the tool or the key for this type of change, and sort of I don't know, think of it in the process of the Wikhikon. It's a process in which we're all engaged with, not just government and those key stakeholders, and sort of the United States is sort of defined by or built upon sort of genocide of American Indians, and sort of everything afterward has just been another chapter within that book. So it's the sake of, in regards to the Wikhikon, sort of changing that narrative through relationship buildings and really starting with sovereignty in the land, and sort of how we can make Indigenous ways of knowing and being policy, and sort of seeing, I don't think there's an answer of the question. I think the answer of itself is within the praxis nature of it, of actually just starting to take action.
And do you both think that a lot of this can be youth-led? Or, I think with just the role of technology right now in getting information and facts and historic documents out to the general public, or there's God, there's wonderful people on TikTok doing just some wonderful videos about Native American history, about like Black History Month. So do you think there's new ways of getting the public interested or engaging with the public and I don't want to say capitalizing on current interest, but it does seem to be a ripe moment where people are engaged and interested in how do we make meaningful change. So how do you capture this moment in time and kind of use it to its full capacity?
Yeah, I think that question is kind of a double-edged sword in some ways. Like, yes, the speed at which we can share information can be incredibly valuable, but I would say that there's also openings for, I guess, groups to spread hatred, for lack of better phrasing. But I think that as long as people can back up those different social media videos and ways of sharing knowledge with actual fact and actual sources, I think it can be an incredibly valuable resource for information.
Yeah, and I think youth voice is yet another sort of voice that's heard but not taken seriously, and again sort of shines a light on education as I think changes within education can sort of provide students to view it as a tool for their own sort of creative, unique purposes. And if you're doing that alongside relationship building with diverse communities, I feel like it's going to result in something that achieves sort of the steps towards justice. And in regards to sort of, I feel like the intergenerational connection also still needs to be there. Sort of, the quote that's coming to my head is that sort of the youth may be able to walk the path better, but the elders know the path per se. So I think that intergenerational communication and relationship building is also important as well.
It looks like Ann Knowles has a question. So there is kind of this parallel with both of your stories that there's problems of how citizenship is defined and who has access to power and who has voting rights, who counts as a citizen. Only those who fit mainstream notions of belonging to a nation, or anyone who claims that they have a right to a voice in society. So I don't know, is there a way of, a lot of this does again come down to education, but is there a way that we can reteach American history? Or you know, I always encourage students to like call out their professors. Why aren't there more you know, books on the syllabus from Native American scholars, from Black scholars, from female scholars? Do you think that kind of push will help? Or how do we change concepts of who is allowed power, who is allowed a voice at the table, who is considered a citizen?
I just wanted to add a little bit of context as well. I'm not sure about the current politics in Lithuania, but in Poland, some of you probably know right now, academics are being taken to court and threatened with imprisonment if they speak truth, if they write truth, if they publish about particularly complicity with the Germans during the Holocaust. And I think in Lithuania that may not have happened much yet because there is so little Jewish presence and so few people are writing about Lithuanian complicity. But I think if Hailey tried to publish her thesis over there or talk about it on a radio show, she would get some serious blowback. So that's really where my question is coming from.
Yeah, and I will say that it is hard to find some information about like whether these laws are being discussed, partially because of a language barrier where I don't know Lithuanian, but also partially because the Jewish community is so small and they are the only voice that speaks out against these things that I've seen. And they're often, like the Jewish community in Lithuania has a small website that they run and they post about events and issues that matter to them. And thankfully it's in English so I can read it. But those stories aren't being broadcast on a wider scale. So I think that's where the danger comes in. And from that site, I have seen that there are like whiffs within legislation that might be leaning towards policies such as the ones that Poland has enacted, which is worrying because if they're not caught soon enough, then you have a similar result as what is happening in Poland right now.
Well, and I think especially with the case of the Holocaust, that all of those with living memories of the events are slowly dwindling away if they have not already. And so there's that, you know, I've been thinking a lot about like historical NIMBY of like this idea of, well, not here, it didn't happen here, that might have been a problem elsewhere. And I think especially as we learn, as we lose the elders, not just in relation to the Holocaust, but, you know, atrocities across the globe, that once there's that disconnection from the actual atrocities and violence, that it becomes even harder. It's a completely different concept of memory. And so, yeah, how do you take advantage of the knowledge of elders to make sure that we have it? I mean, as Nolan brought up, there's been a loss of knowledge often for generations when tribal members pass away. And I guess I don't know if that's an actual question, but it does seem to be this issue that is not quite coming, you know, the solution is not strictly governmental, it's not strictly educational, the community needs to be involved, that there's just so many different forces kind of that need to align in order to make some of these implementations. So Tyler had brought up that in the book Nonviolent Communication, Marshall B. Rosenberg argues that every time we say anything, we're ultimately asking for something from our listeners in return. To the extent that you agree with this, what request would you make of us who have witnessed your presentations? What are you expecting our takeaways to be from this?
That is such a great question, Tyler. And I love that you're already thinking with that sort of mindset within sort of the concept of the Wikhikon as a process in which we're all engaged with and the need for ongoing relationship buildings. Again, referring back to education, I feel like education is key, and you're never, for the case of adults, you're obviously you're never in an age where you can't sort of put a stop to learning, you know. Your life is sort of a process of a lifelong learning. And in regards to sort of requests that I would have for witnessing like our presentations, depending on sort of what you're involved with within your life, because obviously you should have respect as an individual, but also just sort of acknowledging where you are within your place in this world and what you can do. Building relationships with tribes, of course, and sort of seeing what changes you can make within your space that you're involved in within your story that you are connected within this world. Because again, we all have our own stories, they're all interconnected, and finding out what changes and what action you can take within your story is what I would suggest.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I'm going to assume most of you are not in Lithuania right now. So that may be a difficult place to reach. But even if you look at anti-Semitism, or more generally, if you look at other issues of racism or generally discrimination within your own communities, you can start with creating change within your own community, and then that will spread to other communities.
I think that's a great point. And it makes me think a lot about the power of educators. The one commonality between all people, in the United States, for the most part, is that they go through the education system. Every future politician that is going to make change in this world, every future educator, every person working in water rights, every great problem that needs to be solved in this world, they all start as engaged students in a classroom. And so doing what we can, from the earliest age possible to recognize kind of a pluralistic version of American history that doesn't necessarily fit into a neat box and is not celebratory. I always think of all of the adult power makers as children at one point in time. I don't know if that's helpful or not, but if you can catch people early enough, if you can teach them to be critical thinkers at a young age, to question things, to question authority and why certain things are or are not. So one of our board members, Tim Garrity, he noticed kind of an interesting difference between your two research topics, in that Nolan's kind of focuses on coherence and consistencies found in Wabanaki storytelling, whereas Hailey's emphasized efforts to obscure the past. And he talked about some stories last night. As I said, there was quite a lot of alignment between the fellows. Last night we had Catherine discussing inconsistencies in family lore and stories that are passed down. And we had Nola last night talking about fairy tales and changes to kind of societal value systems. So wrapping up your fellowships with us, do you think your experience as a McGillicuddy Humanities Center Fellow gave you, how did you find working with each other, comparing your research? You didn't have an opportunity to meet as much in person as you normally would. Normally there would be a little bit more interaction between the cohort, but I personally see the alignment. Do you also see the alignment, or has working with each other changed your own views?
I think working with each other really affirmed my belief that there's two things in this world, and that's stories and stories of stories. And finding those connections within our stories of stories is honestly my favorite part of this work, is developing relationships through that story sharing and dialogue, and keeping that relationship ongoing. And it's just, it's been great sort of not only listening to the other fellows' presentations, but also reflecting on it and sort of seeing how it can also shape my own project as it continues as well.
So I know we're getting close to the end of time. I'm hoping to wrap up two questions. So I'm going to steal one from the former director of the McGillicuddy Humanities Center, Margot Lukens, who actually, Margot is the principal investigator on the Wabanaki resource portal that Nolan mentioned earlier. So we do have a team of people within the Native American community, the School of Education, the Maine Department of Education, to build this resource portal. So I'm just going to mention that quickly. More information coming soon. But so Margot asks, so UMaine is currently looking for a new dean of education. They're interviewing candidates, and she was kind of surprised that so far none of the candidates seem to, recognize LD 291, but not even specific to Nolan's research. For both of you, what kind of questions would you ask the incoming dean of education? Ollie here is curious as well. So what do you think? What questions would you like to see asked? What kind of educator would you like to see put into the position, or what changes would you like to be seen made?
For me, sort of the changes that I would want to be made is sort of what what is the purpose of education and how is it used within the world, and they're interviewing sort of their views on that and sort of how we can sort of refrain away from developing consciousness within students that does focus around sort of individualism, and recognizing that sort of even within on campus, we're literally in a shared space with each other. And so obviously the having, what's their experience with sort of truth and the mobilization of truth, and just being aware of where they are physically within the land and in the story of place as well. I think those are all very important to keep in mind. Yeah, and I would have a lot of questions for the Dean of Education.
I think kind of similarly to Nolan's comments, this isn't so much a question, but more of a, like, my ideal, I guess, would be to have someone that encouraged like talking about more than just a patriotic history and whatever that means, like recognizing wrongdoings more than just in a fleeting moment in the classroom. And I think that needs to happen starting before college and before high school. And so I think a dean of education that would be teaching future educators would need to have that mindset of impressing that upon students, that they need to address these issues within the classroom.
Do you think the classroom itself needs to change? Do you like flipped classrooms? Do you think students need to be given more power? I mean, just as far as the structure of, I am the professor and keeper of knowledge and you are the audience to learn from me. Do you think that even some of that relationship building within the classroom needs to change in order for greater change to happen?
Right, and that's very reflective of sort of well-known sort of educator, liberation educator, Paulo Freire, sort of the banking concept of education, where the teacher is this holder of knowledge and students are banks to be filled with it. I agree a lot with Freire there, but I also believe that sort of that still leaves out critical aspects of views of land and recognizing the spaces that they're in. So I think the changes within sort of the classroom should be centered around developing reciprocal relationships where there's not necessarily a dichotomy between teacher and student. The teacher should be learning just as much as the students are from them and from their dialogue with them, then also teaching about sort of environmental justice and social issues as well, and sort of how how sort of progress is not always good, so on and so forth, and thinking about how even critical pedagogies can be sort of detrimental to education.
So, oh, sorry, Hailey, yes.
I would just add that I think students should be encouraged at a younger age to ask tougher questions of our society and of our history, and like they should be able to ask as a small child, like, what is racism and how does that like exist in our world, and get an honest answer, and be encouraged to look for those answers for themselves as well. So I would just add that.
I think that's a great point. Something we try to instill in our fellows, that you all are, you know, I think it's hard for students to find their voice and to find their authority on a topic, but I think that you both really excel at doing that, and owning your research and showing your passion. So I think that the best way to close out, and I'm hoping that it's all right with these folks, that I would love to get the impression of both of your advisors here. So I'm wondering if Anne and maybe Darren would like to say a moment about these scholars as they wrap up their research here at UMaine.
I'd be happy to say a few words about Hailey. We've come to know each other well over the last couple of years. She has been so steadfast in the pursuit of understanding a very complicated history. In the case of Lithuania and the Holocaust more broadly, it's just endlessly complicated. And what I hope everyone here heard in her presentation this evening is her judiciousness, that she's weighed the evidence that she's dealt with. She said explicitly at one point, I am not condemning the people of Lithuania, because she believes so strongly in social justice. That includes giving a full measure of concern to those that you otherwise might blame. So I am full of admiration. I've told Hailey before that she is kind of an ethical guiding star for me in our work on the Holocaust.
Wonderful. Thank you, Anne.
Hi, everyone. I don't know if you can hear me. Sorry, I have a little bandwidth set of issues, but I mean, honestly, there's so much to say about Nolan's work. It really is just pushing all the work that we've done, here at the University of Maine, people like Rebecca have done, and just pushing it to the next level. It's really, truly amazing. And I guess, with Nolan out there, I feel like I can maybe take a breath and hand the torch, because his work is just so important and insightful. And I really feel honored to have worked with him, and he's going to do a lot of great things for advancing our issues of Wabanaki education, and more generally the decolonizing work that we are collectively doing here at the University of Maine. So I don't know, I could gush for quite a while, but I really am just so pleased with this work and just where he's gone with it. It's amazing.
Thank you so much to both of you. If you do know other students that are interested in becoming a McGillicuddy Humanities Center Fellow, please do email us at mhc@maine.edu or visit our website. We have a whole section on funding. Ollie is at the end of his rope for today, and I'm figuring many others are zoomed out. So I think this is, excuse us, a nice place to wrap up. So thank you very much for your time today. And thank you so much to Nolan and to Hailey for your great research. And we wish you all of the luck as you continue on. We know that you're both gonna make a big impact on the world. So thank you so much. And we'll see you soon.
Everyone, thank you.
Thank you.